Welcome, dear listener. And thank you for being here. Tonight, we are stepping gently into a world long before streets, towers, or borders. A North America shaped not by cities, but by rivers, forests, plains, deserts, and tides. A land where life moved slowly, attentively, and without hurry. So settle in, lower the lights. Allow your breathing to slow. In this story there is no conflict to follow, no urgency to resolve, only the steady rhythm of ancient life. People living quietly with the land, guided by seasons rather than schedules. If you find yourself drifting, that is exactly where you are meant to be. You can listen or simply rest. As the spoken story comes to its natural end, soft, relaxing music will continue, allowing you to fall into deep, uninterrupted sleep. Thank you for sharing this quiet moment of history. And now, let us begin. Long before cities gathered themselves into grids of stone and wood, before roads cut straight lines across hills and valleys, North America existed in a quieter state. Not empty, not untouched, but unhurried. The land stretched wide and patient beneath the sky, shaped by rivers that had been flowing for longer than memory, and forests that grew without needing to be named. There were no borders drawn here, no signs marking ownership or distance. Instead, the continent was divided gently by climate and season, by mountain and plain, by water and wind. In the east, dense forests spread across rolling terrain, their canopies shifting with the year. Into center, open grasslands followed the curve of the horizon. To the west, deserts and plateaus rested beneath wide skies, while far to the north, colder lands moved slowly through cycles of ice and thaw. Human life existed within all of this, but it did not announce itself loudly. People lived here not as rulers of the land, but as careful participants. Their presence was marked not by permanent scars, but by paths worn softly over time, by fires kindled and allowed to fade, by dwellings that returned to the earth when no longer needed. Time moved differently in this world. Days were shaped by light rather than clocks. Seasons mattered more than years. The passing of life was measured not in urgency, but in repetition, sunrise after sunrise, winter following autumn, children growing into adults while elders rested nearby. The land itself provided instruction. Rivers taught patience, never rushing yet always moving. Forests demonstrated balance, where growth and decay existed side by side without conflict. Even the wind passing over plains and through trees seemed to remind all living things that motion did not require force. In this ancient North America, sound was present, but it was not constant. There were no engines, no crowds, no distant hum carried through the air. Instead, the sounds were spaced and meaningful. Bird calls rose and fell with the day. Insects filled the warm hours with a steady, almost meditative rhythm. At night, the world softened further, leaving only wind, water, and the occasional crackle of fire. Human communities fit themselves into these soundscapes carefully. Voices were used when needed, not endlessly. Silence was not uncomfortable here. It was expected. It gave space for listening to animals, to weather, to one another. It also allowed thought to slow, untethered from constant interruption. The people of this continent did not see the land as something separate from themselves. Forests were not obstacles, rivers not boundaries. These were relationships. Knowledge of the land was passed quietly, through demonstration rather than instruction. Children learned by watching, by walking the same paths, by repeating the same seasonal tasks until they became instinct rather than effort. Fire played a central role, not as spectacle, but as companion. It warmed shelters, cooked food, and pushed back darkness without eliminating it entirely. Fires were tended, not consumed. They burned low in the evenings, glowing softly rather than roaring, mirroring the rhythm of the people gathered around them. Shelters themselves reflected this mindset. They were built to meet needs, not to impress. Materials came from nearby wood, bark, stone, earth, and returned to the land when their purpose was fulfilled. Nothing here demanded permanence. Even villagers understood that they might change, shift, or move with time. Across the continent, ways of living differed, but the underlying pace remained similar. Whether near rivers, forests, plains, or coasts, life followed the same principle: attention rather than control. The land was observed carefully. When it changed, people adjusted. When it rested, so did they. Food was gathered, hunted, or grown with this same attentiveness. There was effort involved, certainly, but rarely haste. Meals were shaped by availability and season, not expectation. Hunger was understood as temporary. Abundance is something to be respected rather than exploited. Even movement across the land occurred gradually. Paths emerged where feet traveled often, not where lines were planned. Canoes slipped into rivers without altering their course. Trails followed animals, water, and terrain rather than opposing them. Travel was not about speed, but about familiarity. In T-Swirled, memory lived not in written records, but in repetition. Stories were told again and again, not to preserve exact details, but to carry meaning forward. Over time, stories softened at the edges, becoming more about rhythm than instruction. Listening mattered as much as speaking. The sky itself played a role in daily awareness. Without artificial light, the movement of the sun and stars guided both work and rest. Dusk was not ignored or overridden. It was noticed. Night arrived gradually, giving time to settle rather than demanding immediate retreat. As darkness deepened, activity slowed naturally. Fires dimmed, conversations thinned. Sleep came not as an enforced routine, but as a response to the world growing quieter. Dreams were considered part of life, not separate from it another way. The mind continued its gentle movement. Generations passed in this manner, not dramatically, but steadily. Elders watched landscapes remain largely familiar across their lifetimes. Children grew up knowing the same rivers, the same seasonal winds. Change existed, but it arrived slowly enough to be absorbed without disruption. This was a continent alive with human presence, yet free from noise as we understand it today. A place where life did not accelerate beyond itself, where progress did not demand constant transformation, where being present mattered more than being remembered. Here, before cities rose and schedules tightened, North America rested in a long, quiet balance. And within that balance, people lived their lives fully, attentively, and without hurry. Long before villages settled into familiar places, before paths became known and repeated, human movement across North America unfolded quietly. It did not arrive all at once, nor did it announce itself as an event. Instead, it occurred through countless small decisions made over generations' choices, shaped by weather, food, safety, and the slow curiosity of survival. These first footsteps did not belong to explorers in the modern sense. There were no maps carried forward, no sense of destination beyond what the land itself suggested. Movement happened gradually, often without intention to travel far. One seasonal camp led to another. One river bend gave way to the next. Over time, people found themselves in new places, not because they sought novelty, but because life gently required it. The landscape guided these movements patiently. Glaciers receded in the far north, opening corridors of grass and water. Animals followed these changes, and people followed animals. The relationship was not one of pursuit alone, but of observation. Humans learned where herds paused, where fish gathered, where plants returned each year. Following life meant staying close to what sustained it. Families moved together, carrying little more than what hands and memory could manage. Tools were simple and carefully maintained. Stone was shaped with familiarity rather than force. Wood was carved slowly, often reused, repaired, and eventually returned to the ground. Nothing was wasted, because nothing needed to be abundant. Fire traveled with them, not as flame, but as knowledge. The ability to create warmth, light, and cooked food shaped where people could rest and how long they could stay. Fires were started deliberately and allowed to fade without regret. The land was trusted to remain. As people moved, they learned the subtle differences between regions. The weight of the air changed. The rhythm of rain shifted. Plants appeared that were unfamiliar at first, then slowly recognized and understood. Knowledge accumulated quietly, passed between generations through demonstration rather than explanation. Children learned to walk where others had walked before them. They watched elders read the ground, the sky, the behavior of animals. Learning did not feel like instruction. It was part of being present. Mistakes were corrected gently, without urgency. There was time to learn because time was not scarce. Movement across the continent did not erase what came before. Campsites were reused season after season. Familiar shelters were rebuilt in the same places. Certain valleys, riverbanks, and clearings became known through repetition. Over time, these places gathered memory without needing to be marked. Paths formed not as lines, but as tendencies. Feet pressed the earth slightly, enough to suggest direction, not dominance. Trails followed water, followed shade, followed the easiest way rather than the fastest. Travel was measured by comfort, not distance. When people encountered new environments, they did not rush to alter them. Instead, they adjusted themselves. Clothing changed. Shelter styles shifted. Diet adapted. The land was not expected to conform. Humans learned to fit themselves within it. This slow expansion across North America created a patchwork of familiarity. People recognized where they belonged by the feel of the land rather than by ownership. Territories were understood through use and respect, not through fixed boundaries. Knowledge of place mattered more than claims to it. Encounters between groups happened quietly as well. Meetings were often seasonal, occurring at familiar gathering points. Exchanges of tools, materials, and stories happened without ceremony. Communication relied on shared experience rather than shared language. Gestures, patience, and repetition bridged differences. Conflict existed, but it did not define this era. Survival required cooperation more often than competition. Resources were managed through restraint rather than accumulation. Taking only what was needed ensured that life could continue without disruption. As generations passed, the memory of constant movement softened. Some groups began to return to the same places more regularly. Familiar camps became seasonal homes. The land's rhythms encouraged a gentle form of settling without permanence. Even then, mobility remained part of life. Belonging did not require stillness. People understood that change was not failure. It was adaptation. The land itself changed continuously, and so did those who lived upon it. Night travel was rare and cautious. Darkness belonged to rest. Fires were shielded, voices lowered. Sleep arrived easily after long days shaped by physical effort rather than mental strain. Dreams carried fragments of the day forward, blending memory and instinct. Morning brought no urgency. Waking followed light and temperature rather than obligation. The day unfolded slowly, guided by weather and need. Plans adjusted easily. Nothing depended on rigid timing. Over centuries, these first footsteps filled the continent without overwhelming it. Human presence expanded, but it remained light. Forests continued to grow. Rivers continued to wander. Animals continued to move according to ancient patterns. What formed during this long period was not a single culture or identity, but a shared understanding of how to live with space rather than against it. Knowledge accumulated quietly, layered gently, never demanding to be finalized. By the time people began to recognize certain places as home, they carried with them generations of movement embedded in their habits. Even stillness held memory of travel. Even settlement retained flexibility. This early chapter of life in North America was not defined by beginnings or endings. It existed as a continuous motion, slow, adaptive, and deeply attentive. And from these first footsteps, all later ways of living would gradually unfold. As movement across the land gradually slowed, water began to gather people more consistently than any other feature. Rivers did not ask to be followed. They invited it. They moved with purpose, but without haste, carving paths that remained dependable even as seasons changed. Along their banks, life found a rhythm that required less searching and less uncertainty. The great rivers of North America, wide, steady, and patient, became centers of familiarity. Smaller streams branched outward from them, forming networks of access and understanding. To live near water was to live with a quiet assurance. Fish returned year after year. Plants grew thicker along the edges. Animals passed through regularly, drawn by the same reliability. Communities formed along these waterways, not through planning, but through repetition. Families returned to the same bends in the river, the same gravel bars, the same sheltered banks. Over time, these places gathered meaning. They were not named in the way cities would later be named, but they were known, recognized by shape, by sound, by the way light moved across the surface at certain times of day. Daily life followed the river's pace. Mornings often began with stillness. mist rising gently from the water as the world warmed. Fishing lines were set without hurry. Nets were checked with familiarity. Canoes slid into the water with barely a sound, guided by hands that understood current and depth instinctively. Food gathered from the river was shared communally. Fish were cleaned and prepared close to the water, their remains returned without ceremony. Nothing felt wasted. The river had provided, and it would continue to do so as long as balance was maintained. Canoes were not symbols of travel alone. They were extensions of daily life. Made from hollowed logs or carefully shaped materials, they required maintenance but rewarded care. Movement along the river was smooth and deliberate. Paddles dipped and rose with steady rhythm, creating a gentle cadence that mirrored the flow beneath. Travel by water felt different from travel by land. Distances seemed shorter. Direction felt intuitive. The river carried memory forward, linking familiar places without effort. People could move goods, visit neighboring communities, or simply follow the current for a time, allowing thought to drift as steadily as the canoe itself. Settlements along rivers were rarely fixed in one form. Shelters adjusted to flooding and retreating waters. Elevated ground was used during wet seasons. Lower banks welcomed activity when levels dropped. The river's changes were expected, not resisted. Adaptation was part of belonging. Children learned early how to behave near water. They watched reflections shift, noticed where currents strengthened, learned which areas were safe and which required caution. Knowledge was absorbed naturally, through presence rather than instruction. The river also shaped social life. Gathering points emerged where paths met water. These places became centers of shared activity, repairing tools, preparing food, exchanging stories. Voices carried softly across the surface, never competing with the sounds of water and wind. Trade followed the rivers as well, though it rarely felt like commerce. Objects moved hand to hand over timestone, shells, crafted items traveling distances greater than any single person might. The river made these exchanges possible without urgency. Goods arrived when they arrived, carried by people who moved according to season and need. Ceremony often took place near water, though it did not separate itself sharply from daily routine. Certain moments were marked, quietly changes of season, successful harvests. Comnel, remembrance. The river witnessed these events without interruption, continuing its movement regardless. At night, the presence of water deepened the sense of calm. Fires reflected faintly on the surface, their light softened by motion. Insects gathered in gentle clouds. The sound of flowing water blended with breathing, with the occasional murmur of conversation fading into silence. Sleep near the river came. The steady sound provided reassurance, masking smaller noises and easing the transition into rest. Dreams often carried fragments of water movement, reflection, depth mirroring the environment in which life unfolded. Over generations, river communities developed deep familiarity with their flood patterns were remembered. Seasonal variations became expected. Even extreme changes were absorbed into collective memory rather than treated as disruption. The river did not divide communities. It connected them. It allowed separation without isolation, proximity without crowding. Life along its banks felt expansive rather than confined. As people continued to live near these waterways, their relationship with time remained unhurried. The river had no need to rush, and neither did those who depended on it. Days passed, marked by subtle variation rather than sharp distinction. This way of living encouraged patience. Waiting was not seen as wasted time. Watching water levels, observing fish behavior, allowing weather to shift, all of it reinforced the understanding that life moved best when it was not forced. Eventually, some river communities grew larger, more established. Earthworks and clearings appeared nearby. Still, the river remained the organizing presence, shaping daily decisions without command. Life along the rivers represented a balance between movement and stability. People stayed close, yet remained adaptable. They belonged without claiming permanence. And as the water continued its long journey across the continent, it carried with it the quiet imprint of those who lived beside it, present, attentive, and unhurt. Over time, along the wide river valleys and fertile lowlands, certain communities began to leave marks that lasted longer than a season. These marks were not sharp or towering, nor were they built in haste. They rose slowly, shaped by hands returning to the same task year after year. Earth was lifted, carried, and placed with care, until gentle forms began to emerge from the land itself. These were the mound-soft ridges of soil, shaped into purposeful patterns. They did not dominate the landscape. Instead, they seemed to belong to it, as though the land had decided to lift itself slightly in places of meaning. The people who built them did so without spectacle. There were no grand announcements, no singular moments of completion. A mound was never truly finished. It was tended, added to, and reshaped across generations. Life around these earthworks remained calm and measured. Communities gathered near them not to rule, but to remember. Some mounds served as places of rest for the dead, others as platforms for gatherings, ceremonies, or quiet observation. Their functions were understood by those who used them, even if those meanings were never fixed in words. The process of building was itself an expression of order. Soil was carried in baskets, lifted from nearby ground without stripping it bare. Work proceeded at a pace that matched daily life. People came and went, adding their effort when time allowed. Children watched and learned without being rushed into participation. Elders supervised gently, offering guidance through example rather than command. These mound-building cultures, known much later as Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippian, did not see their work as separating themselves from the land. The mounds were not imposed upon the earth. They were collaborations with it. Rain compacted the soil. Grass grew over surfaces. Wind softened edges. Nature completed what human hands began. Surrounding villages remained modest. Homes were constructed of wood, bark, and earth, arranged with practicality rather than symmetry. Paths connected dwellings to fields, rivers, and communal spaces. Life unfolded predictably, guided by planting and harvest, hunting and gathering, rest and renewal. Agriculture expanded gradually in these regions, but it did not replace other ways of living. Crops such as maize, squash, and beans were grown alongside foraged foods and hunted game. This diversity ensured resilience. No single source of sustenance was allowed to dominate. The presence of the mounds influenced how people thought about time. They served as physical reminders that life extended beyond a single lifetime. A child might see soil placed upon a mound and return as an adult to add more. Elders rested knowing their contributions would remain quietly held by the earth. Ceremonies held near the mounds were not loud or elaborate. They were marked by stillness as much as movement. Fires burned low. Objects of significant stone tools, crafted items. Shells were sometimes placed within the earth, not as offerings of wealth, but as gestures of continuity. Trade networks extended far from these mound centers, yet even this exchange felt unheard. Copper from distant regions, shells from coastal waters, and stone from far hills arrived slowly, carried through many hands. Each object carried with it a sense of connection rather than prestige. Despite these networks, there was no rush toward centralization. Authority remained diffuse. Leadership, where it existed, was situational and temporary. Decisions emerged from consensus rather than decree. The mounds did not mark the rise of power, but the persistence of shared memory. Daily sounds near the mounds were familiar and soft. The rustle of grass in the wind. Footsteps on packed earth, voices carrying briefly before fading. The environment remained dominant, setting the tone rather than responding to it. At night, the mounds appeared as gentle silhouettes against the sky. Fires nearby cast uneven light across their surfaces, revealing curves shaped by countless hands. Stars moved slowly overhead, their patterns unchanged by human effort. Sleep came easily in these communities. The sense of belonging was reinforced by the visible presence of the past, resting quietly nearby. Dreams often included familiar places, riverbanks, fields, and the rising shapes of the mounds themselves. Over centuries, some mound centers grew larger, others were gradually abandoned. This did not signal collapse, but adjustment. People moved when conditions changed. Floods shifted river courses. Soil grew tired. New places called softly for attention. When communities left, the mounds remained. Grass covered them more fully. Trees sometimes grew at their edges. Animals passed over them without concern. The land absorbed these structures as it absorbed everything else. Those who came later often recognized these places instinctively, even without knowing who had shaped them or why. They sensed meaning in the gentle ridges. The mounds continued to gather attention, not through force, but through quiet presence. This was the order the mound builders created, not rigid, not imposing, but patient. An order that accepted change without erasing memory. An order that allowed the land to remain central. In the long story of North America, these mounds stand as reminders that complexity does not require noise, and permanence does not require domination. They remain as soft evidence of lives lived attentively, over time, in balance with the earth. East of the great rivers, the land thickened into forest. Trees gathered closely here, their branches overlapping, their roots intertwining beneath the soil. Light filtered through layers of leaves, changing shape as the sun moved. The air felt softer, dampened by shade and moss, carrying the quiet sounds of living things moving carefully through undergrowth. Within these forests, villages took shape in ways that mirrored the land around them. They were not placed for visibility or defense, but for shelter and familiarity. Clearings were opened gently, never wider than needed. Trees were removed selectively, with attention to how the forest would respond. What was taken was used fully. What remained was respected. Homes in these villages were built to breathe with the forest. Longhouses and smaller dwellings rose from wood and bark, their walls flexible rather than rigid. Smoke escaped through openings above, carrying the scent of cooking fires into the canopy. Inside, spaces were shared. Privacy existed, but solitude was rare and unnecessary. Life in the forest villages followed a dependable rhythm shaped by season and daylight. Morning activity began quietly, as mist still clung to the ground. People moved between dwellings and communal areas with familiarity, their paths worn softly into the soil. No one hurried. There was time enough for tasks to unfold. Agriculture played an increasing role here, though it never stood alone. Fields were carved from the forest with care, often near villages, but never overwhelming them. Crops grew in mixed plantings, corn rising tall, beans winding upward, squash spreading low. This arrangement mirrored the forest itself, where no single species dominated for long. Hunting and gathering continued alongside farming. Forests offered berries, nuts, roots, and game throughout the year. Knowledge of when and where to find these resources was passed down quietly. Children learned by accompanying elders, absorbing patterns through repetition rather than instruction. The forest demanded attentiveness. Sounds carried differently beneath trees. Animals moved with subtlety. Weather arrived with warning signs that only long familiarity revealed. People learned to notice these details early, developing an awareness that felt less like skill and more like instinct. Village life was communal without being crowded. Tasks were shared naturally. Cooking, tool-making, childcare, and food preparation blended together. No single activity dominated the day. Work paused easily for conversation, for rest, for observation. Storytelling held an important place, particularly during quieter hours. Stories were not performances. They unfolded slowly, often interrupted, reshaped, and repeated. Their purpose was not to preserve exact events, but to carry understanding forward. Over time, details shifted while meaning remained. Ceremonies marked certain moments, but they did not separate daily life from spiritual life. Seasonal changes, planting, harvest, and remembrance were acknowledged through shared activity rather than spectacle. The forest itself was always present during these moments, offering shade, sound, and continuity. Movement between villages occurred regularly. Paths wound through the trees, following high ground, water sources, and clearings. Travel was steady and cautious. Encounters between communities were familiar rather than formal. Visits strengthened connections without demanding permanence. Trade moved through these forests quietly. Goods passed from hand to hand. Stone tools, crafted items, food preserved for travel. Exchanges were shaped by trust built over time, not by negotiation or accumulation. Evenings brought a gradual softening of activity. Fires were tended carefully, their light reflecting off bark walls and packed earth floors. Meals were shared without ceremony, voices lowered as darkness settled beneath the trees. Night in the forest carried a distinct presence. Sounds multiplied, yet felt contained. Insects hummed. Leaves shifted. Animals moved unseen. The forest did not sleep, but it rested in a different way. People accepted this, allowing the night to exist without interference. Sleep came in shared spaces, warmed by proximity and fire. Dreams often reflected the environment, trees bending, paths winding, animals passing quietly. Waking was unforced, guided by light filtering through leaves and the natural rhythm of the household. Over generations, these forest villages remained stable without becoming rigid. Homes were rebuilt when needed. Fields were rested and shifted. Villages adjusted their placements subtly over time, responding to soil, water, and forest growth. Change did not arrive suddenly here. It came gradually, absorbed into daily life without disruption. New tools appeared. Crops adapted. Traditions shifted slightly, yet the overall rhythm remained constant. The forest villages of the East demonstrated a way of living that valued continuity over expansion. Life was measured not by growth, but by balance. The forest remained intact, even as it supported generations of human presence. In this shaded world, time felt generous. Days unfolded without pressure. Seasons passed without urgency, and within the steady presence of trees, people lived lives shaped by attention, cooperation, and quiet endurance. Far from the shaded forests and broad rivers, the land opened into wide, dry spaces where water was less generous and shade was earned rather than given. In these regions, the desert did not invite haste. It demanded patience, attention, and restraint. Life here unfolded under a sun that moved slowly across an open sky, measuring time through heat and shadow. Communities that lived in these dry lands learned early that survival depended on observation rather than force. Rain arrived unpredictably. Streams appeared briefly, then vanished into sand. The ground hardened and softened according to seasons that did not always announce themselves clearly. People adapted not by attempting to control these patterns, but by learning how to live within them. Homes were built low and solid, shaped from earth and stone. Walls held warmth at night and coolness during the day. Openings were positioned carefully, allowing light and air to move without overwhelming the interior. Villages clustered for protection not from enemies, but from exposure. Shared walls and shared spaces conserved energy and resources. Water shaped every aspect of daily life. In some regions, careful systems of channels guided seasonal flows into fields and storage areas. These canals were not dramatic structures. They were shallow, practical, and maintained through steady communal effort. Their success relied on cooperation rather than authority. Farming in the desert required timing rather than abundance. Crops were chosen for resilience. Seeds were planted when conditions allowed, not when schedules demanded. Fields were small and carefully tended. Waste was avoided because excess was rare. Daily routines adjusted to the sun. Work began early, before heat settled heavily. Midday brought rest. Activity resumed in the late afternoon as shadows lengthened. This rhythm was not imposed. It was learned through experience and passed on without instruction. Movement across the land was deliberate. Travel followed known routes between water sources and settlements. Long journeys were planned carefully, often undertaken only when necessary. The desert taught restraint, and those who lived within it respected that lesson. Food preparation reflected this careful balance. Meals were simple, nourishing, and shared. Preservation methods allowed food to last without every resource was valued, not as wealth, but as continuation. Children in these communities grew up attentive to subtle changes. They learned to recognize signs of weather, shifts in wind, the condition of plants. Knowledge was embedded in daily observation rather than formal teaching. Mistakes were rare, but when they occurred, they were remembered. Ceremonial life reflected the landscape as well. Gatherings often coincided with planting, harvest, or rare rains. These moments were acknowledged with quiet gratitude rather than celebration. The desert did not reward excess emotion. It responded to steadiness. Night transformed the desert. Heat released its hold. The sky expanded, revealing stars in extraordinary clarity. Fires burned gently, their light contained. Conversations softened. The vastness that felt demanding during the day became comforting after dark. Sleep in the desert came deeply. The body, having adjusted to the day's rhythm, rested fully. Dreams were often shaped by light and space-open horizons, movement across sand, distant water. Over generations, desert communities refined their ways of living without seeking expansion. Settlements grew slowly, then stabilized. When conditions changed significantly, people moved rather than resisted. Abandonment was not failure. It was adaptation. Stone dwellings and fields sometimes remained behind, gradually blending back into the land. Wind softened edges, sand-filled spaces. The desert accepted these traces without distinction. Despite the challenges of their environment, desert farmers lived lives marked by consistency rather than struggle. Their success lay not in overcoming the land, but in understanding it. Patience replaced urgency. Observation replaced assumption. The desert did not allow distraction. It required presence. Those who lived here learned to slow their thinking, conserve their energy, and accept limits without frustration. In this way, the desert shaped people as much as people shaped their fields. Life remained quiet, ordered, and sustainable, not because conditions were easy, but because attention was constant. And as the sun continued its slow path across the open sky, these communities carried on, living within the desert's rhythms, guided by restraint, cooperation, and a deep respect for the land that sustained them. Between forests and mountains, the land opened outward into vastness. The Great Plains stretched far beyond easy measure, the grasses bending gently under a wide and uninterrupted sky. Here, the horizon did not close in. It remained distant, shifting with light and weather, inviting attention rather than confinement. Life on the plains was shaped by movement. Wind traveled freely, carrying scent and sound across long distances. Herds followed seasonal paths, and people learned to follow with them. Stillness existed here, but it was a stillness that moved a balance between rest and travel that never fully settled. Communities of the plains lived lightly upon the land. Shelters were designed to be assembled and taken down with ease. Materials were gathered from what the plains offered, wood carried from river valleys. Hides prepared carefully. Grasses used for insulation. Everything served a purpose and could be transported when needed. The absence of fixed boundaries did not mean disorder. Routes were known. Seasonal patterns were remembered. The land itself provided orientation. Hills, rivers, and the movement of animals guided decisions without need for markers. Food sources shifted with the year. Hunting provided meat, hides, and tools. Gathering supplemented diets with plants that appeared briefly, beneath. Knowledge of these cycles was precise, carried through observation rather than record. Hunting on the plains required patience more than force. Animals were respected not only for what they provided, but for how they shaped movement. Hunts were planned carefully, often communally, ensuring that success did not disrupt future balance. Daily life followed the open sky's cues. Morning brought activity as light spread across the grass. Afternoons slowed beneath heat and wind. Evenings gathered people together as the land cooled. Fires burned low, sheltered from wind, their smoke rising straight into the open air. Children learned early to navigate space. They grew comfortable with distance, with travel, with the idea that home could move without being lost. Belonging was tied to people rather than place. Encounters between groups occurred naturally along shared routes. Meetings were unhurried. Exchanges of food, tools, and stories happened without formality. Relationships were maintained through repeated contact rather than permanence. The plains taught flexibility. Weather could change quickly. Storms arrived suddenly, then passed. Communities adjusted their plans without frustration. Waiting was understood as part of life, not an interruption. Night on the plains felt expansive. With few obstructions, the sky revealed itself fully. Stars appeared in abundance, their movement slow and reassuring. Fires marked small circles of warmth and light within the surrounding darkness. Sleep arrived deeply here. The body, attuned to daily movement and open air, rested easily. Dreams often carried the sensation of motion, grass shifting, animals passing, wind flowing endlessly across the land. Over time, life on the plains remained dynamic without becoming unstable. Communities adapted as conditions changed. New roots formed. Old ones faded. Nothing was held too tightly. The absence of borders allowed cooperation to flourish. Territory was understood through use and respect rather than possession. Conflict was minimized by movement and communication rather than confrontation. The plains did not encourage accumulation. Possessions were kept few and meaningful. What was carried needed to justify its weight. This encouraged simplicity and attention. In this environment, time felt expansive. Days stretched long beneath the sky. Seasons passed without sharp division. Life unfolded as a continuous journey rather than a sequence of destinations. The Great Plains offered no walls, no landmarks that demanded permanence. Instead, they provided space to move, to adapt, to exist without confinement. Within that openness, people lived lives shaped by cooperation, attentiveness, and respect for the rhythms that guided all movement across the grasslands. Where land met water once more, life gathered differently. Along the long edges of the continent, coastlines stretched with their own quiet authority. The ocean did not move like a river. It arrived and withdrew in cycles that demanded attention and patience. Tides replaced seasons as daily timekeepers, shaping routines without needing explanation. Coastal villages formed where shorelines offered shelter and access. Coves, estuaries, and inlets became familiar places, known by the way water moved through them. The sound of waves was constant, but never urgent, rising and falling with predictable calm. People who lived by the coast learned early that the sea rewarded attentiveness. Fishing followed the tides. Shellfish were gathered when water retreated. Canoes and boats were launched with careful awareness of wind and current. Movement here required cooperation with the water rather than resistance to it. Homes were built to withstand salt air and shifting weather. Wood was shaped carefully, often raised above damp ground. Materials were chosen for durability and ease of repair. Like all dwellings in this ancient world, homes were meant to serve life, not display status. Food from the sea provided steady nourishment. Fish, shellfish, and marine plants formed the basis of many meals. Preservation techniques allowed food to be stored through less productive seasons. Nothing was taken without thought for return. Daily life followed the rhythm of water. Activity increased during low tide and softened as water returned. This created a natural ebb and flow of effort and rest. Time felt circular rather than linear, marked by repetition rather than progress. Children grew up reading the water instinctively. They learned to notice subtle changes, color shifts, wave patterns, wind direction. Knowledge passed easily through observation, reinforced by daily experience. Trade along the coast moved efficiently without haste. Water connected distant communities, allowing goods and ideas to travel steadily. Canoes carried more than materials. They carried familiarity and trust. Ceremonies often aligned with the sea's cycles. Certain gatherings coincided with migrations of fish or seasonal changes in tides. These moments were acknowledged quietly, integrated into daily routine rather than set apart. Night along the coast carried a different presence than inland regions. The sound of waves continued through darkness, creating a constant backdrop. Fires burned low, sheltered from wind. Reflections danced briefly on water before fading. Sleep near the sea was shaped by motion. The steady rhythm of waves encouraged rest, easing thought into stillness. Dreams often mirrored this movement, blending water and light. Over generations, coastal communities remained stable yet adaptable. Shorelines shifted slowly. Villages adjusted their placement. Life adapted without disruption. The sea did not encourage permanence. It reminded those who lived beside it that change was constant, but predictable. Respecting that balance ensured continuity. In these villages, life unfolded patiently, guided by tides rather than clocks. The ocean provided without demanding haste, and as waves continued their steady arrival and retreat, coastal life remained calm, attentive, and deeply connected to the water that shaped it. Across the continent, long before cities rose or borders hardened, goods moved quietly from place to place. This movement did not resemble the markets of later centuries. There were no crowded centers, no fixed prices, no urgency to accumulate. Instead, trade unfolded slowly, guided by familiarity and trust built over time. Objects traveled farther than most people ever would. Stone shaped in one region appeared in another. Shells from distant shores were found far inland. Copper moved gently through hands that recognized its value not as wealth, but as usefulness. Each item carried with it a history of movement rather than ownership. Trade routes formed naturally, following rivers, coastlines, and familiar paths across plains and forests. These routes were not engineered. They were remembered. People knew where exchanges happened, when gatherings occurred, and which paths connected communities without conflict. Meetings between groups often coincided with seasonal movements. People arrived carrying goods prepared over time. Exchanges were unhurried. Conversations mattered as much as the objects themselves. Stories were shared, news passed quietly, relationships maintained. There was no single authority governing trade. Agreements were shaped by custom rather than law. Fairness was enforced through reputation. Communities that respected balance continued to be welcomed. Those that disrupted it found exchanges fading naturally. Goods moved in stages rather than long journeys. One group passed items to another, who passed them onward later. This created wide networks without requiring central control. Trade connected communities while allowing them to remain independent. The absence of empires allowed diversity to persist. No single style or standard dominated. Tools and materials adapted locally, shaped by environment and tradition. Exchange encouraged learning without erasing difference. Trade did not demand growth. It served needs rather than ambition. Items were acquired to improve daily life. Better tools, durable materials, meaningful objects. Excess held little value, as carrying and storing required effort. Women and men participated equally in these exchanges, contributing skills, goods, and knowledge. Roles shifted according to situation rather than hierarchy. Ceremonial exchanges sometimes accompanied trade, but these moments were quiet and integrated. Gifts reinforced relationships rather than obligation. Giving and receiving balanced naturally over time. Even disagreements were resolved slowly. Patience mattered more than speed. Time allowed tension to soften without escalation. Trade reinforced interdependence without dominance. Communities relied on one another without losing autonomy. This balance allowed wide networks to exist without central power. As generations passed, trade routes shifted. New paths emerged. Old ones faded. The network remained flexible, responsive to change rather than resistant. At night, travelers rested where hospitality was offered without expectation. Fires were shared. Food was offered. Sleep came easily after long, steady days of movement. Trade without empires demonstrated that connection did not require control. Exchange did not require a conquest. Movement of goods could occur within a framework of respect. Through these quiet networks, the continent remained connected without being unified under authority. Diversity flourished alongside familiarity, and as goods continued their slow journeys, they carried with them not power, but relationship linking distant places through patience and trust. Across ancient North America, belief did not gather itself into towering buildings or fixed doctrines. It did not demand separation from daily life, nor did it require constant affirmation. Instead, belief existed quietly, woven into ordinary moments, present without being announced. There were no stone temples rising above villages, no permanent structures meant to contain the sacred. The land itself served that purpose. Forests, rivers, plains, deserts, and coastlines held meaning through familiarity rather than symbolism. Certain places were known to carry weight not because they were built upon, but because they were returned to again and again. Belief was experienced through attention, watching weather change, listening to animals, noticing patterns in growth and decline. These observations shaped understanding without needing explanation. Knowledge accumulated slowly, shaped by experience rather than instruction. Ceremony did exist, but it was not set apart from life. It unfolded naturally within seasonal activities: planting, harvest, migration, rest. These moments were acknowledged quietly, often without elaborate preparation. What mattered was presence, not performance. Stories played an important role in shaping belief. They were told repeatedly, changing slightly with each telling. Their purpose was not to define truth precisely, but to offer guidance. Stories explained relationships rather than events, how humans related to animals, to land, to time. Dreams were treated with respect, but not fear. They were considered part of the mind's movement, another way experience continued after sleep. Dreams were shared selectively, discussed gently, and allowed to settle without rigid interpretation. Animals held particular significance, not as symbols, but as companions in shared existence. Observing their behavior offered insight. Respect for animals extended beyond hunting, shaping how people moved, rested, and prepared for change. Ancestors were remembered without separation from the present. The past existed nearby, not behind. Stories of those who came before were woven into daily conversation, reinforcing continuity rather than nostalgia. There was no sharp division between sacred and ordinary. Cooking, building, traveling, and resting all carried equal weight. Attention turned ordinary actions into meaningful ones. Reverence did not require pause. It existed within movement. Belief systems varied across regions, shaped by environment and history. Desert communities understood the sacred through water and restraint. Forest villages found meaning in growth and interdependence. Plains cultures reflected openness and movement. Coastal life centered on cycles and return. Despite these differences, a shared understanding existed. Life was interconnected. Actions carried consequences. Balance mattered. These principles guided behavior more effectively than rules. Leadership in spiritual matters was fluid. Certain individuals were recognized for wisdom, memory, or attentiveness, but authority remained. Guidance was offered rather than imposed. Respect was earned through consistency, not position. Children absorbed belief naturally. They learned through observation rather than instruction. Rituals were experienced before they were understood. Meaning emerged gradually, shaped by repetition and familiarity. Moments of loss were acknowledged quietly. Death was not separated sharply from life. It was understood as part of the cycle, not an interruption. Burials and remembrance varied, but all emphasized return rather than departure. Night often deepened reflection. Fires burned low. Stories softened. The presence of darkness invited stillness rather than fear. The sky, filled with stars, reinforced a sense of continuity larger than individual life. Sleep itself held meaning. Rest was respected, not postponed. Dreams were allowed space. Waking followed natural rhythm rather than obligation. Belief without temples allowed flexibility. As conditions changed, understanding adapted. Nothing was held so tightly that it could not evolve. This approach did not lack structure. It lacked rigidity. Meaning existed everywhere, not in one place. The sacred was not distant. It was immediate. In this way, belief supported daily life without overshadowing it. It offered guidance without control, continuity without confinement. And as generations passed, belief remained present quilit, adaptable, and deeply rooted in the land that shaped every aspect of life. In this ancient world, time was not something that pressed forward. It did not demand attention or insist on progress. Instead, it moved gently, guided by repetition rather than urgency. Days unfolded according to light and weather, not schedules. Life followed a pace that allowed moments to linger without being measured. There were no devices to divide the day into strict portions. Morning arrived when light softened the dark. Work began when the body felt ready. Rest followed effort naturally. Evening came without announcement, carried in cooling air and lengthening shadows. This way of living shaped how people understood time itself. The past was not distant. It lived nearby in habits, stories, and familiar places. The future was not planned in detail. It was expected to resemble what had come before, adjusted gently by experience. Seasonal change mattered more than dates. Spring was recognized by returning birds and softened ground. Summer arrived through warmth and growth. Autumn revealed itself in color and harvest. Winter brought stillness without anxiety. Each season carried its own rhythm, understood deeply through repetition. Waiting was not considered lost time. It was part of the process. Waiting for rain, for animals to return, for plants to grow. These pauses were accepted without frustration. Attention filled the space where impatience might otherwise form. Children grew up without pressure to hurry. Learning unfolded slowly. Skills were acquired through observation and repetition rather than instruction. There was time to make mistakes and correct them gently. Elders experienced time differently as well. Aging was not hidden or resisted. It was visible and respected. Knowledge accumulated through years of observation carried weight. Elders were not separated from daily life. They remained present within it. Work itself followed a calm pattern. Tasks were completed steadily, without competition. Cooperation mattered more than speed. Finishing a task well was valued more than finishing quickly. Travel reflected this understanding. Journeys took as long as they took. Movement was shaped by weather, terrain, and need. There was no expectation of constant arrival. The journey itself held value. Even change arrived slowly. New tools appeared gradually. New practices were adopted only after they proved useful. Nothing was embraced simply because it was new. Night reinforced this gentle relationship with time. Darkness signaled rest without resistance. Fires dimmed naturally. Voices softened. Sleep arrived without struggle. Dreams blurred the boundary between days. Memory and imagination intertwined, extending experience beyond waking hours. Time did not stop during sleep. It shifted. In this world, urgency was rare. Survival required attention, not speed. Balance was maintained through patience rather than force. Generations passed without the sense of being left behind. Continuity mattered more than advancement. Life remained centered on presence rather than progress. Time, here, did not rush. It carried life forward gently, allowing it to unfold fully. When night arrived in ancient North America, it did not come suddenly. Darkness did not fall like a curtain. Instead, it settled gradually, giving the land time to soften. The sun lowered itself behind trees, hills, or distant horizons, and the light changed color rather than disappearing. Shadows lengthened. Sounds shifted. The world prepared itself for rest. Without artificial light, dusk was an important moment. It signaled transition rather than ending. Daytime tasks slowed naturally. Tools were set aside. Movement became deliberate and minimal. People did not rush to finish what remained undone. Night was not something to fight or delay. It was accepted. Fires were kindled carefully as evening deepened. They were not made large or dramatic. A steady flame was enough. Firelight offered warmth and familiarity, not domination over darkness. Around these fires, people gathered, briefly sharing food, quiet conversation, or simply presence. Silence was common and comfortable. Night sounds emerged gradually. In forests, insects began their steady rhythms. Leaves shifted softly as animals moved unseen. Along rivers and coasts, water continued its endless motion, providing a constant, reassuring presence. On the plains, wind passed freely across grass, carrying distant sounds that never demanded attention. Darkness was not feared in this world. It was understood. People knew their surroundings well enough to trust the night. The absence of light did not erase familiarity. Instead, it heightened awareness. Smell, sound, and memory-guided movement when necessary. Children learned early that night had its own order. They were not warned away from it, only taught to respect it. Stories told in the evening often prepared the mind gently for rest, slowing thought rather than exciting it. These stories did not seek to entertain loudly. They eased the transition into sleep. Shelters at night felt smaller and warmer. Shared spaces, filled with the steady rhythm of breathing. Fires burned low, watched until they no longer required attention. The glow faded naturally, leaving embers rather than sudden darkness. Sleep did not arrive by command. It came when the body was ready. People lay down without expectation, allowing rest to unfold. There was no pressure to sleep immediately, and no anxiety of wakefulness lingered. The night was long and generous. Dreams held a quiet place in understanding. They were not dismissed, nor were they overanalyzed. Dreams were seen as part of the mind as movement, an extension of waking experience rather than a separate realm. They were shared occasionally when meaning felt present, but never forced into interpretation. The stars played a central role in night awareness. Without competing light, the sky revealed itself fully. Patterns were recognized. Movement was observed over time. The stars offered consistency, returning night after night in familiar arrangements. They reminded people that time moved steadily, even in rest. On clear nights, the moon shaped activity subtly. Its light allowed limited movement without disturbance. Tides responded. Animals adjusted their behavior. People noticed without needing explanation. Night also allowed reflection without isolation. Thoughts slowed. Concerns soft. The body, having worked throughout the day, welcomed stillness. Even worries felt less urgent beneath the steady presence of darkness. In colder regions or seasons, warmth was shared carefully. People slept close together, conserving heat. In warmer areas, shelters allowed air to pass through gently. Comfort was achieved through understanding environment rather than altering it. Waking during the night was not unusual. People stirred briefly, adjusted position, tended fires if needed, and returned to rest. Sleep was flexible, not rigid. It bent to the body's needs rather than enforcing structure. There was no concept of wasted night. Rest was productive in its own way. It restored attention, prepared the body, and allowed memory to settle. The night was not empty time. It was essential time. As hours passed, the world remained alive but calm. Animals moved quietly. Weather shifted gently. The land rested without becoming still. Eventually, subtle changes signaled approaching morning. The sky lightened almost imperceptibly. Night sounds faded. Air cooled or warmed slightly, depending on season. People did not wake abruptly. They stirred slowly, emerging from rest without resistance. Night in the ancient world was not something endured. It was something lived within. It offered balance to the day, quiet to match effort, darkness to match light. And each night, as it returned again and again across generations, it taught the same lesson without words. That rest was natural. Darkness was safe, and time continued even when all activities ceased. In the long span of ancient North America, change did not arrive with sharp edges. It moved quietly, almost unnoticed, carried forward through ordinary days rather than marked events. Generations passed, not as chapters with clear beginnings and endings, but as overlapping lives, each one settling gently into the next. Children grew into adults without crossing a defined threshold. Learning happened gradually, absorbed through repetition and familiarity. Skills were passed down not through instruction alone, but through shared activity. Hands learned what to do by doing. Eyes learned where to look by watching. Memory formed, not from dates, but from seasons. Elders remained woven into daily life. They did not retreat from usefulness. Their pace slowed, but their presence remained steady. Knowledge accumulated over decades, carried weight, not because it was rare, but because it had endured. Elders remembered changes that others accepted without question: shifts in rivers, migrations of animals, variations in weather. These memories were offered quietly, often in passing, without urgency. Villages changed shape slowly over time. A home repaired many times eventually gave way to a new one built nearby. Fields rested and shifted. Paths moved slightly as terrain responded to use. Nothing was fixed permanently, yet nothing was abandoned carelessly. Names and stories continued across generations, reshaped but recognizable. Certain places remained important, even as their use evolved. A river bend that once served as a seasonal camp became a gathering place, then perhaps a site of remembrance, meaning accumulated rather than replaced itself. There was no strong division between past and present. What came before was not distant. It existed nearby in tools, worn smooth by many hands, in paths pressed gently into the earth, in stories told with small variations that reflected current understanding. Change was accepted without alarm. New materials appeared. New techniques spread through observation and exchange. Adoption was careful, never rushed. What proved useful remained. What did not faded naturally. Movement continued across the land, but it was guided by memory. People returned to familiar places, even as they explored new ones. Migration did not erase attachment, it expanded Italiano. Birth and death were understood as part of the same rhythm. Life began quietly and ended without spectacle. Loss was acknowledged without overwhelming ceremony. Grief was shared, but it did not disrupt continuity. Life continued, carrying memory forward gently. Children grew up hearing stories of those who had come before, not as distant figures, but as familiar presences. Ancestors were remembered through habit as much as narrative through the way food was prepared. The way tools were held, the way shelters were arranged. Time, across generations, felt wide rather than narrow. There was no sense of falling behind. Life was not measured against achievement. Continuity mattered more than novelty. Even conflict, when it arose, rarely defined generations. Disagreements soft over time. Distance allowed resolution. Movement provided space. Nothing was forced into permanence. The land itself held memory longer than any individual. Fields remembered cultivation. Rivers remembered use. Trails remembered feet. These traces remained light, blending into the landscape rather than altering it irreversibly. As centuries passed, some communities grew, others shifted or dispersed. This was not failure. It was adaptation. The land changed, and people changed with it. New generations did not seek to surpass those who came before. They sought to continue. Improvement meant refinement, not expansion. Sleep, rest, and work maintained their balance across lifetimes. The rhythm of daily life changed little. Morning, effort, evening, rest. This pattern remained steady, grounding experience even as details evolved. In this way, generations passed softly. No single moment defined the era. No single voice dominated memory. Life unfolded gently, carried forward through countless ordinary days. The absence of urgency allowed depth. Attention replaced ambition. Presence replaced progress. And as one generation rested, another quietly took its place, continuing the slow, attentive life shaped by land, season, and shared understanding. As time continued its gentle movement, the land of North America remained wide and attentive. Rivers still followed their familiar paths. Forests continued their quiet cycles of growth and rest. Plains stretched beneath open skies, and coastlines answered the steady pull of the tides. Life carried on much as it had for generations, shaped by patterns that felt settled and complete. Communities across the continent lived within systems they understood deeply. Knowledge had accumulated patiently. People knew when to plant, when to move, when to rest. They understood which places welcomed return and which required distance. Balance had been learned not through instruction, but through long familiarity. Settlements, where they existed, were modest in scale. Villages did not crowd one another. Space remained generous. Movement between regions continued without urgency. Trade flowed quietly. Belief remained embedded in daily life. Time remained flexible, shaped by environment rather than ambition. There was no sense of standing on the edge of transformation, no awareness of an approaching threshold. Life did not anticipate change. It responded only when necessary. The present felt sufficient. Earthworks rested beneath grass and sky, their purpose fulfilled without needing recognition. Fields were tended, then allowed to rest. Shelters were repaired, rebuilt, or left behind as conditions required. Nothing demanded permanence. Children continued to learn by watching. Elders continued to guide without command. Stories continued to shift gently, adapting to new listeners while retaining familiar rhythm. Memory remained active, not preserved. Night continued to arrive softly. Fires burned low. Sleep followed effort without resistance. Dreams carried fragments of daily life forward, blending past and present without distinction. The land itself bore the quiet imprint of human presence. Paths remained light. Rivers were not constrained. Forests were not cleared beyond necessity. The relationship between people and environment remained reciprocal rather than extractive. In this world, complexity existed without density. Organization existed without hierarchy. Meaning existed without monument. Life was layered, not crowded. There were moments of difficulty, years of poor harvest, harsh winters, unpredictable weather, but these were absorbed into collective memory rather than treated as crisis. Adaptation followed. Balance returned. Nothing here suggested inevitability. There was no march towards something larger or louder. Life did not push forward. It unfold. The absence of cities did not mean the absence of structure. Order existed in rhythm, in shared understanding, in restraint. Communities knew how much was enough. Time continued to move as it always had, patiently, evenly. Generations passed softly, each one inheriting not a project to complete, but a way of living to continue. The continent breathed slowly. Wind passed through grass and trees without interruption. Water moved freely. Animals followed their ancient roots. Humans remained part of this movement, neither dominant nor displaced. If one were to pause here, just before the tightening of schedules and the gathering of stone, one would find a world complete in itself. A world that did not feel unfinished, a world that did not ask to be improved. Life existed in balance, not perfect, but sufficient. Not static, but stable. Not silent, but calm. This was North America before cities, not empty, not waiting, but living quietly within its own rhythms. A continent shaped by patience, attention, and continuity. And as night settles once more across forests, plains, rivers, deserts, and shores, the land rests easily. Fires dim, voices soften, sleep arrives. The story does not end here. It's simply possessing in the long, quiet moment. Before the world begins to change. As our journey through ancient North America gently comes to rest, the land remains quiet. Fires burn low, rivers continue their patient movement. Forests breathed beneath the stars. There is nothing more to follow, nothing more to remember. The spoken story now fades, and soft, relaxing music will carry on, allowing your thoughts to drift and your rest to deepen. Thank you for listening. Sleep well. El